Denmark's Prime Minister has praised the people of Greenland for their resilience amid mounting pressure from the Trump administration to take control of the semi-autonomous Danish territory.
We need Greenland for national security and even international security, and we're one way or the other, we're going to get it. We will make you rich, and together we will take Greenland to heights like you have never thought possible before.
The Arctic, once dismissed as ice and emptiness, is suddenly the stage for the most humiliating defeat in modern American history. And the villain in this story? Not Russia, not China, but Canada. Yes, Canada, the polite neighbor that just outmaneuvered Washington without firing a single shot. It all began with Donald Trump's bizarre 2019 obsession buying Greenland. What the world saw as comedy was in reality the opening act of a trillion-dollar tragedy. Because while Trump treated Arctic strategy like a real estate stunt, Mark Carney and Canada were quietly laying the foundations for a geopolitical heist. The prize? A staggering $50 trillion in untapped minerals, resources that fuel hypersonic weapons, satellites, and the global tech race. Tonight, we reveal how Trump's arrogance opened the door, how Canada seized the moment, and why America has been left frozen out of the Arctic future. Like, subscribe, and keep watching. The Arctic was never just about ice. Beneath those frozen mountains lies one of the greatest jackpots of the 21st century: molybdenum, niobium, graphite, and rare earths worth nearly $50 trillion. Minerals that power hypersonic missiles, stabilize satellites, and feed the tech giants of Silicon Valley. In other words, resources that decide who wins the next world order. And this is where the humiliation begins. In 2019, Donald Trump turned what could have been America's great Arctic strategy into a late-night comedy sketch. He floated the idea of buying Greenland, a sovereign territory of Denmark, as if he were shopping for condos in Manhattan. Denmark's prime minister called the idea absurd. Trump, in return, canceled his state visit and insulted one of America's closest NATO allies. The world laughed. And while Washington fumed, Canada listened. Because here's the secret. While Trump was blustering, Canadian bankers, mining firms, and diplomats were already laying cables under the ice. They knew the Arctic wasn't a land deal, it was a resource war. A quiet war where contracts would matter more than carriers and trust would weigh heavier than tanks. Enter Mark Carney, former Bank of England governor turned Canadian strategist. Carney understood what Trump never could. Power in the Arctic wouldn't come from waving flags, but from signing deals. Canada didn't need to invade, it needed to invest. Fast forward to 2025, and Trump is back in the White House, angrier, louder, and more desperate. His new obsession? Forcing Congress to declare U.S. control over Greenland's mineral reserves. He framed it as national security, an effort to keep China out of the Arctic supply chain. But in reality, it was a last-ditch gamble to claim what America had already lost. Because by then, Canada had already moved in. Greenland's Prime Minister, Mute B. Egede, slammed Trump's demand as neo-colonialism. Denmark backed him up, invoking NATO's Mutual Defense Clause, effectively daring Trump to turn his tantrum into a war with his own allies. America's Arctic hand was suddenly paralyzed. And who stepped in as the calm, reliable partner? Canada. Through Greenland Resources, Inc., Canada secured a 30-year license to mine molybdenum, a metal critical for aerospace and defense. The deal alone was worth billions. But Canada didn't stop there. With Nordic and Greenlandic firms, Ottawa launched a $3 billion Arctic alliance, bringing Denmark and Norway into the fold. Suddenly, the Arctic was no longer a no-man's land. It was a Canadian-led enterprise with European buy-in.
And the genius was this. Greenland demanded local hiring, profit sharing, and investments in schools and hospitals. Canada agreed because Carney knew it wasn't just about resources, it was about legitimacy. By making Greenland stronger, Canada became Greenland's trusted ally. Meanwhile, Trump raged. He called the deals illegitimate. He warned of sanctions. He threatened NATO funding. But his words carried no weight. Washington had already been locked out of the room. Think about that. The richest mineral reserves of the century slipped from America's hands not because of war, not because of Russian aggression, but because Donald Trump treated Arctic policy like a shopping spree. And while he played salesman, Canada played statesman. But that wasn't the whole story. Because Canada wasn't just winning contracts, it was reshaping the very balance of power in the Arctic. And the real shock would come when the US military realized what it had just lost. The fallout was brutal. When Greenland closed the door on America, the Pentagon discovered it wasn't just losing access to rocks in the ice, it was losing the lifeblood of its defense industry. Lockheed Martin's hypersonic missile program required molybdenum alloys. Raytheon's radar components depended on niobium. Even NASA's satellite frames needed rare graphite sourced from Arctic veins. Suddenly, procurement chains froze. Defense planners were forced into crisis meetings, scrambling for alternatives. But alternatives didn't exist. China and Russia already dominated rare earth production. The Arctic was supposed to be America's escape hatch. Instead, it became Canada's crown jewel. Trump's inner circle called it sabotage, but the truth was more humiliating. The US had sabotaged itself. While Washington tried to bully, Canada built bridges. Carney's $3 billion Arctic alliance didn't just win Greenland's trust, it pulled Denmark and Norway into a cooperative security and investment framework. That meant 2 NATO members were now economically tied to Canada's leadership in the Arctic. France and Poland soon offered joint research funding. What was once America's strategic domain now looked like a Canadian-European fortress. And Russia and China? They couldn't believe their luck. Moscow's state media mocked Trump as a failed real estate broker. Beijing called it the fall of Arctic supremacy. Both countries seized the propaganda win, painting America as a fading empire unable to control even its closest alliances. Inside NATO, cracks deepened. Norway doubled its Arctic patrols, not with American support, but with Canadian coordination. France quietly announced funding for Arctic defense systems, bypassing Washington altogether. For the first time in decades, US military leadership wasn't central to northern security. Canada was. The humiliation spread into markets. Investors who once bet on US defense supply chains began shifting capital toward Canadian mining firms. Amerok Minerals, reviving its Nalunaq gold project with $60 million in Nordic and American private investment, redirected output toward Europe and Asia. America, once the natural buyer, was excluded.
And here's the irony. US money helped bankroll Canada's Arctic victory. Investors, frustrated with Trump's chaotic tariff wars and supply chain instability, poured funds into Greenland projects to hedge against US unpredictability. They didn't trust Washington. They trusted Ottawa. But the real strategic dagger? Greenland's local mandates. Every ton of ore extracted came with requirements: local jobs, profit sharing, and community reinvestment. Schools were funded, hospitals were built. Danish subsidies, once essential, began to shrink. For the first time, Greenland saw a path to independence, not under American pressure, but through Canadian partnership. That's when Trump's rants turned desperate. He threatened sanctions on Canadian firms. He accused Denmark of betrayal. He even floated the idea of deploying US forces for resource security. But NATO allies weren't buying it. Denmark invoked alliance defense, essentially warning that any US move would be treated as aggression against an ally. Trump had painted himself into a corner. He could either escalate against NATO or accept a loss. He chose to rage on social media while America's military quietly adjusted to a new, weaker position. And the consequences were staggering. Without Arctic access, the US faced production delays for hypersonic weapons. Satellite launches slowed. Raytheon warned of shortages in critical defense components. Even civilian industries felt the squeeze. Tech firms reliant on high-performance alloys saw costs climb. What began as a blunder in 2019 had metastasized into a strategic paralysis by 2025. Meanwhile, Canada emerged as the unlikely Arctic superpower, not through military conquest, not through chest-thumping nationalism, but through contracts, cooperation, and credibility. The very things Trump dismissed as weakness became Ottawa's greatest weapons. And that's the lesson Washington never saw coming. In a world racing for resources, arrogance is a liability. America lost the Arctic, not because Canada was stronger, but because Canada was smarter. America didn't lose the Arctic on a battlefield. It lost it in boardrooms, in backroom deals, and in the silence between Canada's handshake diplomacy and Trump's angry tweets. The world just watched the United States humiliated by the very ally it once dismissed as too polite to matter. And here's the cruel irony. Canada never fired a shot. It didn't need to. Contracts replaced cannons, and credibility crushed arrogance. For Washington, the Arctic is now closed.
For Ottawa, it's wide open. And for the rest of the world, this is the warning. Empires don't collapse when they're conquered. They collapse when they laugh at the wrong enemy. What do you think? Is America's Arctic defeat the beginning of its decline, or just another chapter in Trump's chaos? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more hard-hitting breakdowns like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep watching.